I planned to actually have a more elaborate talk, and unfortunate accident actually made it a little difficult, and I'm very meticulous about putting titles, captions, and everything on my PowerPoints and presentations, and I couldn't help but skipping things, and diacritical remarks are missing, and typos abound, so please bear with me. Here we go. According to a biography of Norchen Kunga Jangpo, the founder of the Nor Monastery in central Tibet, Norchen commissioned tanka or scroll paintings of the complete set of the Vajravali cycle, together with 3 additional mandalas from the Kriya Samujjaya collection from Newar artist, sometime between the foundation of the monastery in 1429 and his death in 1456. He commissioned 11 other tankas to fulfill the wishes of the great adept master, Buddha Shri. And those series actually include the painting like this, currently in the Rubin Museum. And the inscription on the bottom of this painting, now in the Rubin Museum collection, states that the wishes of the great noble teacher Sabjang Pakpa may be fulfilled. So colorful and complex tankas like this one may easily fit the bill as pictorial renditions of mind pictures emerging from tantric Buddhist vision practices or those practices described in sadhanas. Unfortunately, for students studying Indian Buddhism, no such scroll painting on cloth survives. After all, the Vajravali cycle mentioned in the biography refers to a ritual text prepared by the famed early 12th century Indian master Abhayagara Gupta, known as the Vajravali Nama Mandalopaika. And as many in this room may know, Abhayagara Gupta was actually active at the Vikramashila monastery, and his other well-known works include the Nishupana Yogavali, which is a collection of ritual manuals for mandala creation, which is often used as an encyclopedic reference text for the study of tantric Buddhist iconography, along with another late 11th or early 12th century compilation of instructions of vision practices, what Benoitoshi Bhattacharya put together as the Sadhana Mala. As Matthew Capstan demonstrates in his astute analysis of the Manjushri Mulakalpa, production and use of painting on cloth, or patta in Sanskrit, seems to have been very much in practice in the late Indian Buddhist context. Even in an arguably non-esoteric Buddhist context, like in a splendid Vision Sutra, translated from a 6th century Gilgit manuscript, we find a liturgical instruction on how to make a painting on cloth for the purpose of seeing. And shortcomings of Cohen's translation aside, it is a straightforward and early reference to a cloth painting made to meet the desire to see. So here you actually have reference to, suppose someone really wants to see me in my true form, and then it goes to talk about how you paint the following scene on a piece of cotton, and use of the color should not be mixed, the paint stored in new pot, and gives the description of the iconography. So it's pretty straightforward reference to making a cloth painting to meet the desire to see. In the absence of a securely identifiable surviving Indian example, there has been numerous attempts to actually sort of tie certain tanka paintings surviving in Tibet to Indian production, but none of them actually are securely identifiable as an Indian production. So I've considered the painted Buddhist manuscripts from India as crucial evidence to think about what these paintings that were made and used in medieval India might have looked like. And I have embraced the pictorial structure of a patta or pauba or tanka as a relevant frame to understand painted manuscripts' iconographic programs. Thus, I have suggested in my book that a painted palm leaf manuscript is akin to a scroll painting on cloth, something like this one. In today's talk, however, I'd like to step back and rethink this assumption and instead emphasize the uniqueness of a palm leaf manuscript as a medium for painting. So there is a tacit assumption about painting in all media, whether it's on a wall or a piece of cloth or on a manuscript folio, that they all belong to a single artistic tradition, and evidence in one can extend to any other medium. And I argue that we need to recognize the emergence of painted manuscripts as a medium of choice for pictorial expression distinct from murals and cloth paintings in medieval South Asia. So what I'm presenting today is part of my second book project, tentatively titled Garlands of Visions, Painted Palm Leaf Manuscripts and the History of Indian Painting from 1100 to 1500. So my book aims to shed light on an important but neglected period of Indian painting by exploring the unique Indian conception of a book, or pustaka in Sanskrit, as an elastic material container of thoughts and visions and its bearing on the history of Indian painting. Iconographic, decorative, and manuscriptological strategies in a group of late 12th century painted Buddhist palm leaf manuscripts, as we'll see today, demonstrate how medieval Indic vision practices relating to tantric traditions, or sadhanas, may have contributed to expanding a painted manuscript's pictorial potential. The unique format of a palm leaf manuscript, if you haven't seen one, loose folios are horizontally stacked together and threaded together by a cotton cord or two metal sticks. And this format made a painted manuscript a fitting vessel for sharing a vast amount of visual knowledge with authority and in secrecy. I suggest that these new ways of sharing visual knowledge we see in painted palm leaf manuscripts contributed to the subsequent development of painting traditions in South Asia, especially because manuscript paintings began to articulate and represent local and historical concerns despite their overtly religious nature. And in my book, I aim to address an important art historical problem of disjuncture and continuity in the history of Indian painting by emphasizing the artistic contributions of painted palm leaf manuscripts in that history. The contributions of the Indic manuscript painting tradition to the history of Indian painting remains completely overlooked to this date, partly due to the received notion of what constitutes a painting worthy of study. And pictures in these manuscripts are often not the most beautiful, I guess. And my husband used to joke, like, "Why is that really? Are you an art historian, or is that really beautiful?" And I think it lies in the eyes of beholder to think what constitutes beautiful painting here. And we're not really going for that kind of beauty here, I don't think. And this is a period that gets completely overshadowed by the study of Mughal and Rajput paintings of subsequent centuries. And by highlighting the contribution of the painted palm leaf manuscripts to the history of Indian painting, and by proposing to read what I call visual vernaculars in manuscript paintings, while considering the potential role of Buddhist tantric practitioners in the context of Second Vernacular Revolution, I aim to provide a new lens to understand the long-lasting legacy of Indian Buddhism in art. So today's talk, I will discuss the iconographic structure in a late 12th century palm leaf manuscript of the Ashtasastrika Pragyaparamita Sutra, now in the Varendra Research Museum. This is that manuscript, and highlight its innovative use of pictures and a successful realization of a painted palm leaf manuscript as a medium for conveying visual knowledge. I'll retain my earlier suggestion about the painted manuscript's potential for realizing a book mandala, but I'd like to emphasize how the Varendra manuscript, containing an amazing array of fascinating deities and a few other contemporaneous manuscripts like it, were very much the product of the early 12th century efforts to categorize, contain, and define the parameters of the explosion of visions, like those of Abhayakara Gupta mentioned before. And they truly realized a sadhana mala in a literal sense, the garland of sadhanas. Before introducing the Varendra manuscript, let me first explain how I see a painted manuscript as a kinetic experiment on a three-dimensional mandala. So one of the main reasons that I got interested in studying the painted Buddhist palm leaf manuscripts in the first place was its apparent disjuncture with the accompanying text. The majority of painted manuscripts surviving from India and Nepal from this time period of 11th to 12th centuries is of the Pragyaparamita Sutra, especially in its recension in 8,000 verses, the Ashtasasrika Pragyaparamita Sutra, which is a text of the Varandra manuscript that I will discuss shortly. So the choice of the Pragyaparamita Sutra for painted manuscripts seemed quite odd, especially given that there are more visually oriented Mahayana sutras available, and why choose Pragyaparamita Sutra where there is not so much interesting visual contents to actually illustrate? So this was one of the driving questions in my first book. Not only the Buddha's life scenes and various bodhisattvas appear inherently unrelated to the text. So here you have Buddha's life scenes on the side panels of the first two and last two folios. The most intriguing visual feature images that are placed upside down to the running direction of the text. So if you can sort of recognize these panels, everyone seems to be doing headstand, right? And I did not put this in the wrong direction. You could easily do this when you're manipulating your digital images, and I sometimes sort of accidentally flip images. I don't know if you have done that. It does happen, but this is not that. It actually is the right direction of the text. So if you want to see her correct, then the text will run upside down, right? If you sort of see this folio in isolation, it just looks like, what is this nonsense, right? But if you see this in the context of a manuscript where you will open the folio in this manner, two pages are always, just like you open the book this way, you open this manuscript this way, and two pages will be open in front of you. And when you see them together, you kind of see what the point of those two and one being upside down was. Did you just sort of catch that, what just happened? I'm just trying to sort of show how you would flip the page and then they will be together, right? So we can appreciate the innovative spirit of the medieval Buddhist manuscript makers. In this case, his name was Mahidara, and he made this for a lay male donor, Lakshmidhara, as they utilized the book's inherent quality as a three-dimensional object with movable folios, where these images will unite physically, symbolizing the union of karuna, compassion, and pragya, wisdom, the essence of the enlightened mind, or bodhicitta, in the heart of the manuscript of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. I emphasize the kinetic aspect of a manuscript as a usable three-dimensional object, and other pictorial and manuscriptological features in this manuscript suggest that the maker of this manuscript may also have been very much mindful of the kinetic quality of a manuscript as a physical object. So I'm showing the illustrated folios from this manuscript. They fall at the beginning, in the middle, and the end of a manuscript. So if we consider a manuscript's three-dimensional space, in this case, a group of seated deities who are inactive appear on the first two folios. Two central panels actually mark the Buddha Shakyamuni in the posture of enlightenment with Pragyaparamita. So these two will be sort of central message of, almost iconic message of the whole text. The other four, and in this manuscript is quite interesting that the iconography program runs beyond its own space, so that group of four will connect to the center. So if you look at my diagram, these four somehow relates to this in the center. So these are on the central folios of folio 141 and 142, And the next group actually runs to the last folio. So it really goes beyond its own space, own visual space. So in the center of the manuscript, we have Sambaran Hebajra Kalpadhara, example here. So you saw these two actually uniting, and I don't have to do animation again to sort of suggest these two will be together as well. So the upside down placement of their consorts anticipate and predict their union in action, and they suggest a sense of movement. And the painted form of Kalpadhara Hebajra that you see here in particular is depicted in the most active manner, not only because of his iconographic form described in his sadhana, but also because of the pictorial elements used to render Hebajra with his wide open bloodshot eyes with a scary grin. He dances ecstatically as 16 arms spread out and surround him holding skull cups. The soaring flames that emerge from his compassionate action cannot be contained within the given space any longer and begin to be spilled out to the rest of folio. So you notice the artist sort of went over the framing of this panel. And in this particular manuscript, we find a very rare appearance of Kala Chakra in the most fascinating form with his consort Vishwamata. So this pictorial portrayal comes very close to the description of the main deity of the Kala Chakra mandala described by Abhayakara Gupta in the Nishvana Yogavali. And if you're familiar with the Tibetan Buddhist context, Kala Chakra is pretty big in Tibetan Buddhism, whereas you don't actually see an image of Kala Chakra surviving anywhere from India or Indian context. And this is a very rare form. And you notice how you actually have 3 sets of colors. So you have 24 arms divided by 3 colors. And even the legs are different colors. We sort of seeing different colors in play here to sort of display the spectacular 24 arms of Kala Chakra. And even rarer is to find a pictorial rendition of Vishwamata as an individual deity. So these two actually are described in the Nishvana Yogavali as a couple, right? And often when you see sort of Tibetan representation of Kala Chakra mandala with figurative form like this, Vishwamata, you rarely see her as an individual deity. She's always shown as embraced, right? So you only see back of her. So it is precisely thanks to the manuscript maker's utilization of the pictorial space within a putti format book that these female deities are given independent spaces and an individual status. And this is quite similar to how these deities are described in the Nishvana Yogavali text itself. So while the text indicates that they are embracing each other, Kala Chakra and Vishwamata are described individually and in a consecutive order. So the description will give this form and then this form, and then they're supposed to be embracing each other. And this, I hope I'm making sense that these textual descriptions actually go quite well with these separate painted panels that are possible because of this painted manuscripts format. Yes? So I thought this manuscript was the most extraordinary example in terms of esoteric Buddhist iconography realized in a medieval Indian Buddhist context. And I do admire the innovative spirit behind this manuscript design greatly. Given the late date of the manuscript in an Eastern Indian Buddhist context, this is dated Lakshmana Sena Sambat 47, Gata Sambat 47 year, which actually puts it to that date is actually wrong. It's 1226. That's my typo. Anyway, it puts it into the early 13th century where we're believing that Buddhism is no longer extant in Indian soil. So the Parakalabhavan manuscript, this manuscript stays in Parakalabhavan, and I will refer to it as a Parakalabhavan manuscript. It's still an ingenious masterpiece in Buddhist manuscript production in medieval India, but I was taken aback by what I saw when I finally had a chance to open a manuscript in the Virendra Research Museum in Rajshahi in Bangladesh after intense negotiation and collaborative efforts. And it took multiple trips to this institution to actually get my hands on this manuscript. So you're seeing something that took many sort of trips and efforts to actually see and finally document it. The Ashtasastrika Pragyaparamita Sutra manuscript, now in the Virendra Research Museum, was first discussed by Sachindranath Siddhanta in its descriptive catalogue published in 1979. Based on the post-colophon on the last folio of this manuscript, Siddhanta Babu suggested that this is a late 13th century manuscript dated with Nepala Samvat 393 or 1273 Common Era. And a few more recent publications that include painted pages from this manuscript follow this dating. As Guru Melzer and Tanaka Kimiaki pointed out in separate publications, the date on this colophon page clearly reads Nepala Samvat. So Shuryoshtu Samvat 696. Which is 1576 Common Era. So a scholar actually wrote to me, a scholar from Japan wrote to me suggesting this must be a 16th century manuscript. Well, the truth is this is not a 16th century manuscript. This is a post-colophon added later in Nepal. While this is not the original colophon, however, based on paleographic and stylistic and as well as iconographic considerations, I do believe this manuscript to be late 12th or early 13th century Eastern Indian creation. As we see here, the last surviving folio is numbered folio 352. I'm sorry, it's not 352, 532, sorry. Well, you can't see it actually, it's on this one. 532, and the original manuscript is missing folio 351. So this is folio 350, and it's missing 351. And it would have had an image of Vasudhara facing, so this one sitting there is Shambhala. And it would have had the folio 531 would have had Vasudhara, the goddess of wealth, who would have been harmoniously paired with Shambhala as in the Parakalabhavan manuscript before. And I hope this folio, this missing 531, actually survives somewhere. And someday we will know more about its production site and patron. And finding this missing folio is not a completely unrealistic mission, as out of 12 folios that Siddhanta Babu recognized as missing from the otherwise complete manuscript, which he rightly surmised that they would have contained miniature paintings, 10 folios are in the collection of India Museum. I'm showing you the 5 folios out of the 10 lot, and a single folio is now in the Jnana Prabha in Varanasi, or at least it was on display in 2003. And the only folio unaccounted for is folio 310. So I suggested we're missing folio 531, surely with Vasudhara, and this will contain the original colophon from the time of its creation. And if you somehow look out and find a folio looking like this with the goddess Vasudhara, alert me, because I am in dire need to actually find this folio. But would that help me actually understand the production site and everything else? Having the original colophon page does not necessarily increase one's chance of identifying its production site and its intended use, as these donor and scriber colophons in Eastern Indian manuscripts in particular are extremely formulaic. And many names of the localities are difficult to identify with certainty. For example, another rare example of a painted manuscript of the Karanda Vyuha Sutra survives in the same museum in Rajshahi in Bangladesh. And the colophon on folio 67 verso identifies the donor as a lay female donor named Sahuka, who is identified as the wife of one Naishu Padri, who was a resident of Japura Pataka, or Japura town. Well, there is an interesting possibility that this Japura town may be the town today known as Joypur in Purulia district in southwestern part of West Bengal. But this is only based on the folk etymology, just the similarity of the sound of the name, so it's a conjecture. But this manuscript of the Karandavya Sutra is reasonably close to a dated Pancharaksha manuscript now in the National Archives of Kathmandu, National Archives of Nepal in Kathmandu. And this is dated with Govindapala's 18th regnal year, so it actually dates to the late 12th century. The site of production of this Pancharaksha Sutra, now in Kathmandu, is also a matter of speculation, despite a clear indication of a place. So this is where the donor colophon starts, and here there is a mark, and then the scribe actually missed where they're from, the donor's name. So he really inserted where she's from. So it says Vakalanga Avastita, so a resident of a Vakalanga. And I speculate this is somewhere in Bengal, but our topographic knowledge of medieval India is very limited, to say the least. So we'll actually need further research into where Govindapala was active and which communities and what localities used his regnal year to deepen our understanding of these sort of provincial sites of production of manuscripts. It is also extremely interesting to note here, this is more of a side note, but that both these manuscripts are patronized by female donors. The donor of the Pancharaksha Sutra was Hiraka, who is identified as wife of Thakura or Bahudana, and the other one, the Karandavya, was another person's name given with a female donor named, Sahuka, who was also identified as a wife of somebody named Naishu Padri. And our manuscript is quite similar to the dated Pancharaksha manuscript in the manuscript in Barandra Museum that I'm discussing today are quite similar to this manuscript in terms of style, but also especially in the format. So these are actually prepared with much shorter palmate folios than most monastic, earlier monastic productions. So what this shortening of these folios, so if you think about it, this is a palm leaf, folios, and they made it shorter. And what does that achieve if you actually are making a manuscript? You get more folios, right? You need more folios. And what does that mean? That you will have a thicker and heavier and heftier book, right? So, which really truly conveyed its material capacity and physical presence. And so the height of the stack is, more than 3 inches actually. And another similar manuscript in the Frenier collection in Musée Guimet is also dated with Govindapala's regnal year, and that too is a high stack with at least 473 folios. And this is usually double and more than double the number of the folios that you will see in most monastic productions, which ends at around 200 to 220 folios. So let's open this manuscript. The manuscript opens with 2 painted folios with Amitabha and Pragyaparamita facing each other on folio, the first and the second folio. And you can see these marks are actually indication of its ritual offerings to the goddess, actually. And this pairing of Amitabha and Pragyaparamita is a standard affair, actually. As we have already noted, the last 2 folios would have had Jambala and Vasudhara pair, which also follows a convention of placing cultic deities at the end, guarding the rear gate of the manuscript, so to speak, and guarding the proclamation of religious merits of the patron. And as sort of knowing what to expect in this kind of manuscript, one were to go straight to the middle of the stack and check out the center of the manuscript, where the end of chapter 11 falls, on folio 255 to 256. These are not so unusual either, except perhaps the 8-armed form of Avalokiteshvara. This pair of two bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshvara on top and Maitreya on the bottom, albeit both in slightly different forms, do appear in the center of a mid-12th century Ashtasastrika Pragyaparamita manuscript dated to 1147, circa 1147, prepared for a monastic donor in the Vikramashila monastery, now in the British Library. So this seems to be a very standard manuscript. But this manuscript originally contained 62 painted folios, marking the end of each 32 chapters, except for chapters 19 and 22, and the 2 folios placed at the beginning. So if you do the math, right, 32 by 2 is 64, minus 2 is 62. And we're missing 13 folios in the Varandara Museum collection, but we have 11, so we're only missing 2 painted folios out of 62. If we are to examine the manuscript as it was supposed to be handled from the end of the first chapter, we meet with a pair that indicates a clear sense of male-female sexual union through the placement of upside-down females on the second page. Again, I did not put that image, or didn't put that image upside down. This is how the text runs. The white male deity, seated with 6 arms, 3 faces, reminds us of a form of Manjushri as an aspect of Vairocana in the Manjuvatra mandala of the Nishpana Yogavali. But the attributes don't quite match, actually. And to begin with, the sword of the Manjuvatra mandala, Manjushri, actually appears on the right hand, and he also needs to hold a pustaka, or a book, on blue lotus. The female deity's iconography is identical to the male, which actually certainly goes with the idea of Svabha Vajradatvi, which is the female consort or companion of Manjushri in this Manjuvajra mandala. But it's rather unclear who these are actually, and I'm still searching for my answers. The end of the second chapter is marked by the Kalpadhara Hevajra and Nairatmya pair we have already seen in the Parakalabhava manuscript. But I would actually like to point out this extraordinary feature of his face. If you look very closely, his face actually has these, this is not any unusual scratch mark. It's really fine lines drawn to, as if this is netted over his face. And it's not, it is quite intentionally done here. I just want to point out this is quite individualized. So it is remarkable that this powerful form appears so early on in the sequence of manuscript order. In most other examples, these powerful esoteric deities belonging to what may be classified as the Yogini or Yuga-Niruttara Tantras, especially the Hevajra Tantra cycle, Sambhara cycle, or the Kalachakra cycle, are strategically placed towards the end or in the center, as if hidden deep in the letters of the text to be revealed after many, many layers. So at the end of the third chapter, we find an unusual form that reminds us of Kalachakra, given the use of the tree color, right? So you have white, yellow, red, and blue. But other than the tree color, this is not 24-armed Kalachakra form, and his form actually is decidedly closer to a form of Sambhara, and certainly his, so if you compare these two, they're getting the idea of multicolored limbs from Kalachakra cycle, but not necessarily Kalachakra here. And if you sort of think about where Vishwamata was, the female companion is completely different. So this is 10-armed blue female consort, whereas Vishwamata actually is yellow and 8-armed. So it will take too long to go through every single example from this manuscript. And as you can see, the iconographic identification of each deity in this manuscript is very much work in progress, and it's actually very challenging. Well, I'm eager to share as many examples as possible it will take too long to discuss each example. And I do fancy doing a workshop on esoteric Buddhist iconography and really get down on the business and actually really name them all and come up with a system. But that awaits to happen in the future. So I'll point out a few idiosyncratic examples and instead discuss the significance of some of the pictorial strategies seen in the overall design and in the execution of each painting. So one of the most unusual forms that I have ever seen in a Buddhist context appear in this manuscript. So at the end of chapter 12, we meet these two deities, again paired for coupling. Can anyone sort of point out what seems odd here? Well, it looks like a mirror image, yes. That's emphasized by, somebody said one leg? That's right. This is the single occasion that I've ever seen in a Buddhist context, an Ekapada deity. Ekapada meaning one-legged or one-footed. So, he got 12 arms. 12 arms, so common. It's nothing to compare to that one leg. And you have a paired form who is identical manifestation, swabha, and both are ekapada or single-legged. So I've been looking for possible textual references to this particular form in a Buddhist context. Ekapada deities are not so common, and I thought if I actually find a cycle that actually includes an ekapada deity, maybe that's where this system lies, but I haven't been lucky yet, and I'm still searching. And if you encounter any reference to a one-legged deity, please alert me. So, Ekapada deities are not so common as I mentioned, but we have a good number of surviving examples of Ekapada Shiva from Orissa or Odisha. And these Ekapada forms of Shiva are known to be a form of Bhairava or terrific aspects of Shiva. So according to Donaldson's survey, the earliest surviving images of Ekapada Shiva date to the 8th century, with some developed examples found in the Shakta context of the 10th century temples, like Hirapura Yogini temple actually have Ekapada Shiva image. But most of these Shiva Ekapada images are two-armed or four-armed at most. And as a form of Shiva, the Ekapada Shiva is distinctively ithyphallic, which is not the case in this Buddhist manuscript, as you can notice here. While the exact iconographic nomenclature has escaped my efforts so far, I do think it is important to recognize the placement of this unusual form at the end of chapter 12, folio 280, verso to 281 recto, as the Ekapada couple also falls in the roughly middle point of the manuscript, which is an important spatial location in the manuscript's inner space. And in terms of the overall sequence of the related forms that appear in this iconographic program, it seems to mark almost a stopping point like a danda in the set of letters. Another unusual form that we do not expect to see in Indic context appears, or at least within Indian Buddhist context, appears at the end of chapter 16 on folio 326 verso. This male deity fashioning a very snappy buffalo head with 36 hands. Trust me, I counted, and there are 36. I can't really sort of come up with a number for the legs, and I think there might be 18. If you sort of can figure out how many legs he has, do tell me. But I think the idea is for more of a multiplicity of legs rather than really exact number here. And this particular form most likely relate to a form known as Mahavajra Bhairava, popular in Tibetan Buddhist context, like this one. So connection with Yamantaka is articulated with buffalo head, and a form of deity of Yamantaka appears at the end of the manuscript riding the buffalo, and that buffalo's head kind of looks similar to this head although that buffalo actually has a very tamed head, whereas this one is really bloodshot and angry. But it does not feature multiple heads that are commonly seen in Tibetan and Nepalese examples, which ultimately link this form to Bodhisattva Manjushri. This is also the only ethiophalic deity in the entire system. So all these male deities in wrathful forms, none of them are ethiophalic, but this one is distinctively male, suggesting the connection with Bhairava. Indicated in the name, this form is known in Tibetan and Nepalese context. And in addition, we have a, unique sort of example of his consort known as Vetali in Tibetan context. And I'm yet to find a Sanskrit compendium or sadhana known from a decidedly Indian context that features and describes the forms of these two. So just as I explained with Vishwamata's form, you will rarely see Vetali as a consort or companion of Mahavajra Bhairava as a single deity. And I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the iconography is very much articulated and individualized, and they're really trying to sort of depict all the attributes correctly. Although what that correct means, I don't know, but there's a much effort to really distinguish and differentiate, whereas some paintings of this period actually do kind of smudge over what the iconographic attributes might be. So it's this person working on these paintings had consultation of some kind to actually be able to draw, albeit cursorily, all the elements that are supposed to be in the hands of these deities. And this effort to individualize each deity showcases a remarkable pictorial talent and ambitions on the part of the makers of this manuscript. This is particularly stunning in the execution of facial expressions. These may be various forms of the same deity in some sequence, or the same form in different moments. So for example, Hevajra appears in sort of union with different yoginis, and although they are all sort of black or blue-black, even the shade of blue is differentiated sometimes, and when you're actually looking at these painted panels, they really look at you, or they just catch your eyes. They're so, the grins and the faces are each very much differentiated. So in the Tankas and Pavas, where expectations of iconographic correctness and orthodoxy seem to result in the development of rigid iconographic rules and iconographic conformity, such individualization and whimsical expressions are rarely seen. It is distinctively in the realm of painted manuscript production we find these individualized examples of pictorial expressions that are somewhat more related to the personal level of experience than the transcendental aspects assumed in later understanding of the tantric vision practices. Here I'd like to draw attention to a passage that Bhattacharya, Menoritoshi Bhattacharya, in his characterization of Buddhist sadhana practices. I find this quite useful, despite sort of overtly psychological undertone here. It seems useful for our understanding of the individual and personal nature of the vision practices and their resulting pictures. So he really does identify how these visions come from different people, different conditions rise in different manifold appearances in the concrete shape of deities, and this is in his introduction to the Nishvana Yogavali of Mahapandita Abhayakar Gupta, published in 1949. I'll give you a moment to take a look at that passage. So I would argue that the medium of palm leaf manuscripts as usable and portable objects with kinetic nature of experience of handling the manuscript provided perfect canvases for containing and circulating these diverse visions and their experiences. By emphasizing the connection between the manuscript paintings and the known sadhanas, I'm not suggesting that they were visual aids to these practices. They certainly contributed to shaping and sharing this vast visual knowledge being generated by various masters. As I have argued elsewhere, it is important to acknowledge the diversity and more individual, perhaps more vernacular nature of the tantric vision practices, known in the Sanskrit compilations prepared at the turn of the 12th century. The paintings in the Varandra Museum manuscript certainly exemplify individual nature of these visions before the codification and dogmatic standardization of forms in their variety and expressiveness. I may still find a mandala that explains the whole configuration. For now, my thought is more in the line of kinetic compilation of the visions in the portable multi-part object, made circulatable but only in a limited circle, that was possible precisely thanks to the form of a poti format manuscript. It is more like a pictorial compendium of the visions that were eagerly compiled and categorized by Buddhist scholars like Abhayakar Gupta. As a series of visions connected through line after line of the text of the Pragyaparamita, the ultimate teaching of which is shunyata, which is evoked in almost every sadhana, the Varandra Museum manuscript is not too different from the Vajravali series. Vajravali literally means a row of or series of Vajras, commissioned from Newar artists by Norton in the early 15th century. Especially given the back of that tanka actually has all the letters that really consecrate and make present of the deities that are represented on the front. It is perhaps more compact and singular as an object. Given these tanka paintings, this actually measures up to about, when it has a mount, it actually is over like 1.5 meters almost. So these tanka paintings are big, and remember they were ordered as sets, right? So you had to have so many, and it's quite cumbersome to have the whole set, whereas this manuscript is, while hefty, it's one singular object. So whether the original patron may have thought of this manuscript as something akin to the Vajravali series is unclear. And it is very much an analogy and a speculation, but I wonder if it isn't possible that the makers of this manuscript had this idea in mind. In the context of the Nor monastery, where you find these series, we should also note that in addition to celebrated tanka collections and the murals prepared by Newar artists, the Nor monastery also had a large collection of Sanskrit palm leaf manuscripts, and a number of these were painted manuscripts as recorded in the 1935 report by Rahul Sankratayana, who went on several missions to Tibet in search of Sanskrit palm leaf manuscripts. None of the painted manuscripts catalogued in Sankratayana's report is of this particular type, but he did not get to examine every manuscript in the Nor collection either. Now, many manuscripts that once belonged to the Nor library are dispersed, and it will be difficult to reconstruct this context. Would Tibetan hierarchs have been inspired by a painted manuscript like this? I'm yet to look for an answer, but given at least one manuscript dispersed around the collection in this country seems to follow a similar garland model. I would like to call this a garland model or mala model. And these manuscript folios in the US collections are often linked to Giuseppe Tucci's activities in Tibet. It is not an impossible possibility to think this connection. Certainly, I hope my insistence on recognizing painted manuscripts as a distinctive category will help us find historical clues to understand the reception of painted palm leaf manuscripts and their special qualities as articulated in Tibetan Buddhist literature. So I'd like to end today's talk with a little addendum on the reception and use of the Barandara Research Museum's manuscript. So the post-colophon that I sort of flashed at the beginning of this manuscript sequence gives an interesting picture of its use in Nepal. So this manuscript actually survived in Nepal instead of Tibet. The language of colophon is Sanskrit with many Newari inflections with some straightforwardly Newari phrases. And I had to SOS to Alex von Rospat in Berkeley asking to help me with the Newari phrases in this, and it's still in the sort of stage of, very draft stage of translation of these, this colophon. And I have to thank him dearly for stepping up for this call. As I mentioned before, this dated Nepal Sambat 696, which puts it 1576 Common Era, and it starts with an elaborate accounting of the day this manuscript was taken out and ritually used. It was apparently on the fifth day of the dark half moon in the month of Kartika, which puts it the 20th day of the 7th month of the lunar calendar. It records the ritual recitation of the Pragyaparamita and offering of the flowers and others, and the dedicating of the merits accruing from this act to long life, health, wealth, and growth, possibly of family or even sons. And also fascinatingly, the rebirth in Sukhavati heaven, which I am yet to encounter in any sort of Nepalese manuscript context in terms of wishing to be reborn in Sukhavati heaven. And we have whole family members of Shakya Bhikshu, including 2 wives and 2 daughters. So, and then it actually has additional inscription that accounts for many more family members. They all had to agree to come together to do this puja, apparently, according to this colophon. And what's fascinating to me actually is the record of all these family members here. And the phrase that I just said, Shakya Bhikshu and his wives and daughters, if you understand what Shakya Bhikshu would mean, should sound actually strange, right? Bhikshu is monk, right? Buddhist monk. And here you actually have Shakya Bhikshus with wives, at least like one has 2 wives and 2 daughters. And it's actually interesting that that the one with 2 daughters actually wants the growth, possibly meaning the growth in family with sons. And the other one lists 5 children, including 3 daughters and 2 sons. And they're both Shakya Bhikshu and their wives. And somehow the main patrons of both sort of colophons actually happen to be worded as wives rather than Shakya Bhikshu himself, which is interesting on its own right. So, and that I have to sort of come to the manuscript pages like this from Nepal. And this is mid-12th century manuscript of Pragyaparamita Sutra. This is not palm leaf, this is painted blue-black paper manuscript of Ashtasasrika Pragyaparamita Sutra, where in the last folio you have the whole family members. And here I'm trying to sort of point out how you have the ritual master with his wife and son, possibly. And then there are examples of Nepalese manuscript cover. This actually belongs to a manuscript dated to 1135. And when I first saw this, I thought, well, there's a monk and the female donors maybe behind. But then I realized, well, they're kind of too close to each other. And then there is what seemed to be a younger person behind. And maybe this is really Shakya Bhikshu with his wife and son. And there's a whole array of them in this sequence of the images. And the manuscript, in a way, in the Varandra Research Museum, that colophon really sort of vivifies for me. The context is sort of comes alive when I connect them with what I see in these sort of painted portrayals of the donor figures and patrons of these rituals. So how did this manuscript get to Nepal? I don't know the answer to that question. Certainly, well, it traveled from somewhere in India to Nepal, and it belonged to a Buddhist community who honored the book with a ritual worship and recitation in the 16th century. And that particular manuscript actually survived in Asansol, whereas this manuscript, it actually says it was prepared. It actually gives you a place where this was taken out to do the puja. So what we see in the 12th, 13th century Nepalese manuscript paintings do come to mind when you read the colophon like this, with a community of married householder monks and acharyas who became the foundation of Newar Buddhism. And by various connecting points, including a manuscript like the Varandra Research Museum manuscript, it links so closely to late Indian Buddhism in practice. While the 16th century patrons did not seem to have been so concerned about the manuscript's amazing content, its generative and transformative power was very much acknowledged and cultivated. So, thank you.
Would you like to take questions?
Sure.
Do we know if these manuscripts were used in sort of public performances? So I'm wondering if, say, when you have the male-female union, when you flip the page, if that was for the person reading it or whether there was an audience watching the film?
Well, I mean, the size of these manuscripts make it more private, but then the recitation ritual that happens in Nepal today is quite a public affair. And often the colophons, at least in Nepalese context, seem to indicate that there were people gathered around it. So definitely it's, and I don't think who's looking at it is not even a matter, in a way that that it really does sort of enact that movement. And you sort of do recognize that they will come together if you flip it. And I've seen multiple occasions where people will just come and go and watch them, and unless you're the main patron and his family. So in Nepalese context, I'm pretty sure this is actually quite a public affair in a private context. So because the wording of this particular colophon is actually quite illuminating, because it really had to have everyone's consent, like with that agreement that they took this book out. And the sort of implication seemed to be that ordinarily they are actually kept in a safe or in a box, which is the case in like today's context as well. So, but in Indian context, when this was actually made, I can't say for sure. I want to fancy that this was sort of ceremonial object and brought out for like grand rituals, but I don't have any evidence to actually support that. So
the female deities are always upside down?
No, that's a great question. Well, they are. But this manuscript is so fascinating because there is one case where, so if you see the arrangement, female deity always appears on the bottom folio, right? It's always going to be the recto of a manuscript. But this one actually has an interesting combination where upside down folio actually happens on the verso. And I thought, well, maybe somebody made a mistake and put the upside down deity on the verso by accident. And what's strange is actually that deity actually has odd number of arms, and you never see an odd number of arms, 7 instead of 8. And this is unheard of, and it's almost, I do believe it's actually intentionally done, but she's still upside down when she's on the verso. So that really catches your eye, actually, because you expect them to be in that order, and then somehow she's flipped on the other side. And that really catches your attention. And I was sort of puzzled by this whole arrangement. And I kept looking and I realized, you know what, she actually has 7 arms instead of 8. And am I making this up? And no, it's actually really an odd number of arms. And yeah, that's another clue that I'm looking to find sort of more sort of information on. Yes?
Can you say something more about some of the other illustrations? I noticed there were spaces where they had like a swan or a flower, and I've seen this in other manuscript traditions where you see those particular things like a hunsa or some kind of flower. And why are they? Is there any textual reason why they're in those spaces, or is there just kind of a break, like a double dunda, and then throw a flower in? Or
Oh no, so those, so the most elaborate ones actually appear on. Did you see one here?
Yeah,
well, there is one.
the flower, and then
Yeah.
further back
So often when you see animals, flowers, and like very elaborate patterns that appear in these miniature forms, that's often in a monastic production that's very elaborate. Like a manuscript made in Nalanda, for example, when it's very elaborate production, will have these elements, and it actually is in place of these painted panels. So it marks the end of a chapter. So often in all the painted manuscripts of like 11th century, you don't actually get to have each chapter, and it's very costly production. So at the beginning, they only put painted folios at the beginning and the end, and the end of each chapter is marked by sometimes quite a charming drawing of a deer or bird or animal, or just flowers. So it does happen to be the chapter ending markers, like thumb index markers. So that's what they are for. I don't think there is any textual reference to that effect, but I'm also searching for more textual sources that might actually discuss the production of or use of manuscript as medium for painting. And I haven't, so far I have only negative evidence. So all the sort of manuals that discuss paintings or painting practice in the context are all about murals or cloth paintings and other sort of wide surface medium, not this particular, it's portable, small, and multi-part surface, and that actually is a very important element to remember, that it actually is a very distinctive object in comparison to like wall painting or like cloth painting.
So just to follow up on that, so we don't know anything about the artists at all, or even if they were just whether they devoted themselves just to illustrating manuscripts as opposed to painting on walls, or what their status was, or
Nope, we don't know anything about them. If I'm lucky, I have scribal colophon that indicate who was the person who wrote this, right? But in certain cases, I do believe the lekaka or dharmabhanaka in monastic context might actually have had interventions in actual painted panels, partly because the calligraphy in the hand and the flowery sort of elaborations on certain letters do sort of go very well with how you would do details of faces, and you need that kind of training and in hand to be able to execute such fine painting in monastic production especially. So, and for provincial productions like the Barakala Baba manuscript, I'm imagining this person who's an itinerant acharya who goes to different places, get commissions and make it himself with his son. And that's his trade. And so I don't think this, especially when you get to sort of later 12th century manuscripts, when it's not a monastic production with like scriptorium, then I'm sort of imagining a very small cottage workshop for production. But I don't have an actual sort of textual description of these people working, so not yet. Still looking.
Do you ever have, in my limited experience of Tibetan illustrated folios, they're only ever illustrated on one side. In the Indian case, do you have them where they're illustrated on both sides of the folio?
Very rare, but there are examples actually. It's very rare. And it actually is for a reason why they're double-sided. that it's often somehow the chapter is too short, that you have two chapters happening simultaneously. And so it's rare, but it does happen. Yes?
In terms of these four lost manuscript folios, is this a case where a particular person just went through the manuscript and only took the painted portions that they thought were valuable, and then their collection wound up going to various museums?
Oh yes, precisely how that happened, especially the folios that end up in the Western collections. When the manuscripts were, a lot of the Sanskrit palm leaf manuscripts were taken out from Nepal, and they went to the British collections and Indian collections during the colonial period. But the things that come out of Tibet especially are all sort of through this art market where you have painted folios are sort of scattered. And what's sort of tragic is even in a museum where you have a whole manuscript, sometimes the folios, painted folios are taken out and separately accessioned. Even the painted panels are given each accession number as if you can cut it. And then the text folios are all together bundled in a whole, mixed the text folios. And that's sort of a very unfortunate practice. And I'm hoping there's a lot of there has been a campaign, at least in India, to really raise awareness of these precious manuscripts that are being damaged by the weather or poor sort of care. So I'm hoping that actually raises much awareness, and I'm sort of campaigning to really put them together in right order and keep them in a safe way. And so hopefully that actually helps to put them in a context that they're supposed to be. What?
So, do you know how these manuscripts were kept in the monasteries where they were originally from? Like once this ritual of reenacting the union of deities was done, like were these manuscripts are considered as a different kind of books than usual manuscripts that didn't have that kind of inverted icon?
Well, so I believe all these painted palm leaf manuscripts are actually made in this cultic context where each manuscript is this considered this powerful object. And it is in whether it has this tantric Buddhist images that are placed upside down or not, it didn't matter in terms of its power, but I think there's an expectation of its potency. And as sort of indicated by the 16th century colophon, that they seem to have thought at least this will generate such great merit that will actually increase their wealth, health, and growth of family. So it does sort of seem to indicate that whether they did sort of really think what this was in terms of all this compilation of deities, there is a belief in that, the power of this as a very powerful cultic object. And it didn't quite, the ones that survive in Nepal and they actually accrue a lot of marks of offerings and devotional activities. So you have good layers on top of the manuscript. So you actually do see when a manuscript that has been in use in that way are taken out. And even in a Western collection, when you see a manuscript, when sometimes the manuscript has like really thick layers of sandal paste powder and the vermilion powder and everything that people are sort of paying homage to, and then when it goes to museum, they want to clean it up. So there are practices of that kind, but it all sort of indicates and even the manuscripts that may not have painted folios sometimes actually have been in the context of puja or offerings. So you do get that at least in the Nepalese context. And my understanding is it didn't quite change but there might be degree of how powerful you think this manuscript might be. What's fascinating about these later manuscripts is how this Pragyaparamita Sutra is really transformed into the suitable object in the Tantric Buddhist context.
So do you see in the same way that you can see residue offerings on the, I assume you mean on the top when it's closed like this. Do you have any sense that there are markings in the inside pages that show actual use?
So that's a great question, and often the most used pages are the first two folios. So you can, and from gathering from what I've observed in Nepal, often they actually have them exhibited in that manner that people will have a chance to come have a darshan basically and touch it. So, and often when a ritual is going on, there is an opening, like. And also the last two folios are often the most used. So there are traces of placing the tika marks on deities, and especially in the case of Pancharaksha Sutra that's in the Kathmandu National Archives in Kathmandu, that actually has each painted panel have a marker that indicates it was sort of paid homage to and touched the whole painted panels of the whole sequence. So you do sort of get a sense that, and today's ritual of Pragyaparamita Sutra or Pancharaksha Sutra puja, you actually do get acharyas evoking the deity to come in and reside in the, so it becomes a vessel to actually have the goddess come in. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Could you tell us something about the technical qualities of the paint? Because I'm thinking you have two painted images. If they're at the bottom of a stack like that, they're pushed heavily together.
Right.
Which suggests that they might sort of blur into each other, or there might be some damage. But they seem not to be damaged by being in such close contact. So how does that happen? With Western books, often they have a small sheet of paper over the image to stop any damage to the image. Right?
So the Pancharaksha manuscript that I mentioned actually do have paper curtains in between like every panel actually has a painted curtain over, so it protects the painted panel, and that's actually in the context of it being used. I think because each painted folio has tika marks, meaning it was sort of venerated in that manner, and they really try to protect it in many symbolic ways and physical ways. This manuscript, that's a great question, and I'm really investigating, trying to understand the pigments and what's actually in use and what actually determines the color choices. And surprisingly, the ones in the bottom or in the middle, it just doesn't show much of a change in terms of contact. When it's poorly preserved or kept, sometimes they actually stick together and has like really irreversible damage to them. And sometimes, so like mold grows in between the painted folios. So that
can happen simply with the lettering. Even if there's no pictures.
Yes, absolutely. It happens no matter what. It doesn't have to be painted folio. But what puzzles me with this particular manuscript is I don't know if you noticed, some of the folios actually have this, what seems to be a smudge mark on the painted panel, and I just cannot figure out why certain painting would actually discolor like that over the others. And maybe there is a sense where this is located. I'm still trying to understand why that happened. And so that's very much a question that I'm trying to answer and understand, but I don't have an answer for you right now. Yeah.
But what are the pigments used?
Well, it's often sort of earthly and, let's see, the yellow orpiment, and so many are earth-based or sometimes organic matters, and let's see, the pigments here, especially, I don't know what, I never sort of attempted to have anyone to analyze the pigments. Well, I have a fancy to actually do that on this manuscript, but I don't know if I will have resource or conviction to actually convince the people in Rajshahi to do that. But the pigments are often, it's the earth matters often, and ground stones, and and often, metallic and sulfur. So you have very toxic, actually, content in these pigments. And you wonder how long they lived, actually, the people who are making these. The ink itself is soot-based, so it's carbon-based, but these colors are actually quite dangerous, it seems. And it's so interesting, this one actually doesn't have green. I don't know if you noticed, no green actually strikes out here, and green is like very unstable because it actually reacts, because it's made between blue and yellow mixed, and blue is also unstable in this context, so it actually changes a lot. And I don't know why this particular manuscript actually lacks green, but anyway, so I'm investigating, but I don't have an answer yet. Yes?
So one thing I'm interested in is that it seems to me that the ethnography is of tantric content, but the usage of the ritual context is not specifically tantric. And if that is the case, then one would expect the ethnography to be divorced from to be kind of free from the sadhanas or ritual texts, because the deities are not necessarily a part of a tantric visualization or tantric rituals. If the ritual involved here is only just making pujas and reading it in a large gathering.
No, that's a great question, and I do ask that myself. What's the use of having all these paintings of tantric deities in it anyway? But you need to understand that colophon is really 16th century use rather than the time of production. So we don't know what the context was actually in terms of its original use, and that's why I'm sort of dying to really find the original colophon to understand who the donor was and what. I don't have high hopes on that account because these colophons are so formulaic. But in terms of the tantric deities, the first question would be, why on earth would you put that in? Put this group of deities in a Pragyaparamita Sutra? The text doesn't have anything to do with these texts. But as I mentioned, it does have. In Tantric Buddhist context, Pragyaparamita Sutra is Pragyaparamita as an idea, and the teaching of it is such an important matter. And all the sadhanas, if you read them, there is an evocation of shunyata, and sort of that's a basic bottom line. And it's almost whoever made this is using this as sort of creating a Vajravali or sadhana mala in pictorial form. I don't have any textual support to actually sort of really strengthen this argument, but the way this is done is sort of suggestive of that kind of understanding. So I'm saying this is a knowledge and more of a speculation, but I do suspect that's part of the reason why it actually has so many tantric deities in the manner that is arranged and in such individualized manner. That actually really reflects the ground level understanding, or whoever is making the person's understanding of these visions. It might be described in certain sadhanas, but these forms that are represented in this particular manuscripts really do not match up with any known sadhanas yet. It vaguely matches, but it actually has very individualized features, and that's why I think this is really using the Pragyaparamita Sutra as a vessel to really create this, and this is our new attempt in a way. Yes?
Just to speculate further, it also seems like by having these deities in union, it's some sort of a way of binding the text. Even if it's never used, if it's always closed, it has this cohesiveness and
right.
This sort of sacred glue that's holding it, joining each page back to back with
right.
deities.
Right. No, that's a good suggestion. And what I'm thinking about is actually more from the perspective of a person who's designing this, rather than it's what it did in its later life. So in terms of understanding what the logic or rationale is of having a Pragyaparamita Sutra manuscript with these fascinating array of deities that you'd never see anywhere else, at least so far. I have never encountered so many in such diverse forms and such localized and such individualized forms. That's what's very unique about this particular manuscript.
So just a follow-up question. So, because all those pictures with the red backgrounds are kind of are depicting the violent form of a deity, or so the double form of a deity. So, but the violent forms actually, well, many have some kind of a reservation because it indicates that the vessel contains some kind of a violent spirit and something you have to deal with it very carefully. At least that's the understand the explanation I got from like Tibetans who are trying to explain the existence of violent forms. Do they have any like uneasiness with the violent deities there?
Well, if you have a chance to read, there's a David Schnellgrove's translation of Tevajra Tantra, for example. And there are many, many tantras. Kala Chakra Tantra is translated, at least the sadhana version is translated by Vesna Willis, and Chakra Samvara Tantra also has sections translated. If you actually read these sections, and any other tantras actually do get a sense, they're not really hesitant about elaborating, articulating these really powerful forms. It has more to do with really countering that fear rather than it's violent itself, right? And that's the logic behind the form of Vajrabhairava, that it's, that negation of whatever fear of death, for example. So, I mean, I understand the tradition's desire to actually pacify these images in certain ways, but I don't think the understanding from the 12th century context or 11th, 12th century Indian context, these were so hesitant to actually really make them. They're not commonly seen. I don't think these were actually commonly seen, and I doubt that's why I emphasize this. The manuscript actually allows it to be circulated in certain contexts. It's not going to be displayed on walls. This is actually only opened for certain people who are actually allowed to see this, at least in the context of tantric communities. And that's the understanding that's given in Vajra Tantra, that if a manuscript of Vajra Tantra goes into wrong hand, that's a disaster. You have to really acknowledge who is actually initiate and went through certain stages of initiation. So that's the context when this manuscript is made. And of course, when you react to the form itself today, it seems quite violent. And yeah, they are, but I also think there is something to be said about their expressiveness that is not as violent as you think. They're, smiling and kind of, the descriptions give you the sense that these are sort of beings that are generated from practices that are described in happening in Channel Ground and other sort of special places that are not open to like everyone and anyone. Yes?
So one of the deities was like scratched, you said,
Yes.
this intentionally.
Right. Do you have any idea?
Like, based on what you're saying right now, it seems like they don't want to interact with that deity, or
Why?
they don't quite understand it, or they didn't quite understand that portion of the text, or I don't know.
Well, I mean,
I don't know.
well, and I don't think it's necessarily the scar. It's actually really looks like a net, and there is a description of certain headgear that actually covers the head, and I wonder if that's what they're trying to actually depict. So, but well, thank you for that suggestion.
Did you ever think of taking all the pictures individually and either yourself or getting one of your computer graphic friends to just kind of make them like so they string out animated?
Oh, that's what I actually wanted to do for this presentation. Thank you. With this hand injured, I couldn't really achieve that. So that's what I actually want to do that. And that's sort of my mental image for understanding this as, sort of really like whoever made this had that vision is at least my speculation.
Well, something we can do now that they couldn't do then.
Yeah, no, I think sort of a lot of this digital animation techniques and what you sort of can do with interactive sort of platforms is really making me think about this as a very special medium to really that fit what was sort of prescribed and described in these practices.
I think now it's time to turn the last page. Thank you for a fascinating talk.
Great, thank you.